Tip number 1 is not to panic. Lots of people find themselves unemployed. It happens more often than you think. So number 1, don't panic. Think about what happened to you, and it's important to actually plan out your next steps that you want to accomplish in your life. Being dismissed from employment is obviously a jarring experience. People relate to their work, so it's totally understandable to be upset from it, but take the time, sort of reflect on what happened and reflect on what you want to do next. Tip number 2 is to write down what happened. So it's important to actually keep a log of the events leading up to your termination and what happened when you were told the news. So think about if there was an argument you had with your boss, if there's any workplace dispute. Also reflect on whether or not you think you were terminated due to a particular reason, if you were targeted rather than some of your other employees. These are all events that you can write down. The reason being is that memories obviously fade over time, and if you eventually start a lawsuit, you may be asked to recall the events at your termination. Tip number 3 is to create a plan. Think about what you were doing at your job and if you want to continue doing that. Do you want to stay in the same field of employment, or is there something you've always kind of wanted to try out, venture a new line of work? Think about what you actually want to accomplish in your life. Take the time off from work to actually devise a plan and go from there. Tip number 4 is to keep a job application diary. So it's important to actually diarize your job search records and any efforts you're putting into finding new employment. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is if you apply to EI, employment insurance, the government will want to see that you're actually trying to secure a new job while receiving EI. The second reason is if you start a lawsuit, you have what's called a duty to mitigate, which basically means you have to take reasonable steps to find new employment. Tip number 5 is to contact an employment lawyer. So employment law is a complicated area of law. It's a mixture between employment standards legislation, contract law, and human rights law, among other things. So an employment lawyer can advise you whether or not the severance package you were offered is reasonable. They can look at your employment contract to see if there's any clauses that limit the amount of money you're owed. They can also advise you on whether or not you have obligations that exist beyond your termination. So things like non-competition agreements, non-solicit agreements, and things like that. So overall, if you speak to an employment lawyer, it's important to determine how much you're actually owed after your dismissal. Tip number 6 is don't be afraid to demand more than what's offered to you at your termination. Typically, employers will offer you a severance package upon your dismissal, and in exchange for that, you'll be asked to sign a release, which pretty much bars you from starting a wrongful dismissal claim later. So don't be afraid to actually take the time to look at this severance package, talk to a legal professional to see whether or not it's reasonable, and then go back and try and negotiate a higher amount if your employment lawyer suggests that.